Assalamu alaikum and welcome everyone. We are so sorry, we have to apologize for some technical mishaps. Now we are going live for the series of lectures on Against Normalization of Ties with Israel. And this is the series of lecture number 3. And the topic is, we will be bringing is Israel, the Apartheid State. So we have tonight a special guest that we brought to you, Mr. Miko Peled. Miko Peled is an international speaker, and he is an Israeli American activist, and he is also he is also an ex-karate instructor, and he is the author of a very famous book, The General's Son, the journey of an Israeli in Palestine and injustice, the story of the Holy Land Foundation. So we are very fortunate tonight, and welcome Miko. How are you,
Thank
Miko?
you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's good to be with you again.
Okay. So I'll go straight to the questions then, because we are also running out of time, a little bit late, yeah? So first, we would like to know a little bit about yourself and your journey to this Palestinian activism.
Well, again, thank you for having me. It's really nice to be with you again. And thank you for holding this series. I think this is very important. And it's of course, a very important subject, particularly with the developments over the last few days with the normalization relations with Israel, with the UAE. In terms of my own story, as I relate in my book, in The General's Son, I come from a Zionist family, an Israeli family. My family was very much involved in the Zionist project. My father was a general. I had an uncle who was a president, and we had people in our family were all involved very heavily in the Zionist project. And I grew up to be a Zionist and very privileged and believing in the Zionist cause. But then later on in life, I became aware that there was a problem. There was a conflict because we had this one reality where Israelis lived, and then we had a completely different reality where Palestinians lived. And I couldn't quite understand how it could be that something that I was taught was good and true, which is Zionism and the State of Israel, could be doing things that are so terrible. And gradually, I came to understand what Zionism is. I came to understand better the whole project of the State of Israel. And I was forced to make a moral decision. Where do I stand? Can I stand with Zionism, which is, the legacy of my family, really? Or do I break away from that and stand with my moral values for justice and freedom and equality? Because the two can't live together. And the choice I made was to reject Zionism, to reject the State of Israel. I think there's no other way to maintain a moral life if you support the State of Israel, if you support Zionism. You either support racism or you oppose racism. There's no space in between. And then I began to speak, and I wrote my book, and then I wrote the second book, and so on. And of course, in my travels, I was very fortunate to come and visit Malaysia as well. I had a wonderful visit there. So that's really the short version, the synopsis of the journey that I took.
Well, that was actually very enlightening to hear about your background. So we understand that the very recent happenings at the moment, and very controversial things, which the United Arab Emirates, as you know, has just announced a full diplomatic relations with Israel. Before that was Jordan and Egypt. And we would like to know what would be your take on this normalization of ties with Israel, especially among the Arab states. Yeah.
I don't think really there's much of a difference between the Arab states and not Arab states. I think the point is whether a government decides to take a moral decision, like in the case of Malaysia, for example, that does not have relations with Israel, or does not take a moral decision. And obviously, the decision made by the UAE is abhorrent. It's it's immoral. It's wrong. It's connecting another Arab country to this process of legitimization of Zionism, legitimization of the oppression of the Palestinians, legitimization of the genocide that is taking place and the ethnic cleansing in Palestine. And of course, it's wrong by every standard. And it points to, I think, a corrupt mentality where, for whatever material gains there were for the government of the UAE, they chose to take the step and to normalize and have relations with Israel. So I think it's abhorrent. I believe the Palestinians already pulled away their ambassador from the UAE. One would hope that other countries would follow suit, and that and they would see that this is an unacceptable step. In fact, what needs to happen is that more countries pull away and end their or at least downgrade their relations with Israel, like the South Africans did, for example. Not begin and sign agreements to start diplomatic relations with Israel. One would hope that that process or the trend would be in the other direction. So this is a very sad state of affairs, I think, and I think they will feel the results of this. I mean, you see this on social media already. The criticism is severe. The criticism of the UAE is severe on all fronts.
Yeah, that sounds truly very apartheid state. Yeah, as we understand that in a very simple word. But this apartheid word is actually closely linked to South Africa. Many of the viewers may not understand actually what apartheid is all about. So we would like to hear from you.
Well, apartheid is when you have different laws for different people based on living under the same government. So, for example, when I am, the way I was raised and the way I grew up and the life that I had when I was living there, and the life that I have when I visit and when I'm there, because I'm there a lot of the time, is completely different. The laws under which I and people in my sphere, the Israeli Jews, live, is entirely different, both in terms of laws and in terms of the day-to-day reality of life, completely different than that of Palestinians. Now, what the State of Israel did is it created different levels of privilege. So obviously, the Israeli Jews are at the top. Then you have the Palestinians who have this quasi-citizenship. They're called the Palestinian citizens of Israel. Then you have the Palestinians who live in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Then you've got the refugees who live, all around the countries around Palestine. And this is how Israel maintains this apartheid. So the Palestinians have different sets of laws, and they don't all have the same sets of laws, depending on precisely where they live and where they are on this ladder, if you will. That determines what kind of laws govern their lives. And of course, the laws that govern the lives of Israeli Jews are completely different. The privileges that we have are not shared by the Palestinians at all, in any way, shape, or form, whether it's legal, whether it's access to water, access to resources, the ability to build, what happens when we get arrested, what happens when a Palestinian is killed, nobody cares. There's rarely an investigation. The police does not go to investigate when crime is being committed against Palestinians and so on. So this is what apartheid is. It's a legal system, but it's also goes beyond the legal system. Excuse me. It goes beyond the legal system to the day-to-day life, things that are not necessarily enshrined in law, but are just, a Palestinian cannot buy a house or live in a neighborhood, in a nice neighborhood where Israeli Jews live. Palestinians do not get the same access to water. It's not necessarily because it's the law, it's just because it's the way it is, and so forth. So it's basically a racist system that different people living in the same state, under the same government, but do not enjoy the same rights and the same privileges.
Exactly. In other words, that there are policies, practices that constitute this apartheid regime. So what are those policies that they practice in Israel?
Well, I'll give you an example. I was born and raised in Jerusalem. I've lived overseas for many years. If I go back tomorrow, I still have my citizenship. I still have my rights. I still have my privileges. If I want to get a job, if I want to have a home, there's no problem. A Palestinian from Jerusalem, to begin with, does not have the same rights. In other words, I have citizenship. The Palestinian in Jerusalem does not have citizenship. Palestinians in Jerusalem only have what is called a residential permit, a residence permit. And if they go away for more than a certain number of years, they lose it. They can't come back. They lose their property. They lose their rights. They can only come back as tourists. Now, Palestinians have been living in Jerusalem since the days of Salah ad-Din, maybe before. Over 1,000 years. My family came less than 100 years ago. So it doesn't make any sense. Why would I have privileges over Palestinians? But that is just, again, excuse me, this is my throat. That is just one example of the different policies and the different laws that exist. Now, in the southern part of Palestine, the entire southern area that's the southern part of the country is called the Nakab. And the Nakab, there are about 250,000 Palestinian who are citizens of Israel, Palestinian Bedouins who are citizens of Israel. The majority of them live without access to water, without access to roads, without access to proper medical care or education. And they live very close to Israeli Jewish-only colonies and cities where they have all the access to, some of the highest standard of living, the highest standard of living you could possibly want, across the street from each other. You've got Palestinians whose land was taken away, who have been kicked out of their homes and their land and placed in townships, living in terrible poverty, not allowed to cultivate their own land, whereas you have Jewish colonies across the street that have access to water, can cultivate the land. And even though the Nakab is a desert, it's a very fertile desert. The land there is good for cultivation. And these are all citizens of Israel. In other words, these are Palestinians who are actually citizens of Israel, living quite literally across the street from Israeli Jews who are citizens. And their lives are vastly different, entirely different. So this is, again, some of this is policy, some of it is law, and some of it is just the habit of racism, the habit of discrimination against Palestinians. And again, we're not even talking about Palestinians who live in Gaza who have no access to, or even live in worse conditions.
Well, that sounds very depressing, yes. Class them into different groups and definitely impacted the Palestinian society as a whole. On the other side, we see that, Israeli Jew, the basically are the people, the ordinary people, on the streets. So how it would they feel, like you yourself being an Israeli citizens, these governments impose such policies. We want to understand the people on the street, how do they feel about this, their government's policies?
Well, anybody's following the Israeli politics and the Israeli elections, you know that Israelis vote. Israelis had a lot of elections over the last year and a half. They had 3 elections. And the people they voted for are the people who execute and these policies. The people who create these policies. There are people who are legislating these policies and legislating the racism into law, and have been doing it for decades. So Israelis feel very good about this because they keep voting for these people to come back. You know, the people who represent, the people who are in the Israeli parliament, in the Knesset, and the Israeli government, were voted by the people, you know, in large numbers. That's why they're there. So it's obvious that Israelis are quite happy with the way this issue is handled and with the racism and the apartheid regime. It's very easy in some cases to say, well, you know, the government is doing all these things but doesn't represent the people. In Israel, that's not the case. The government represents the will of the people. The people and the government and the military are all in agreement on these policies, are all in agreement about the ethnic cleansing, the racism, the killing, the genocide of Palestinians, and the apartheid regime. They agree with it and they support it and they keep voting again and again and again for the same people to execute these policies. And again, this has been going on since the State of Israel was established over 7 decades ago.
Yeah, exactly. We see that the United Nations has passed many resolutions before this, and we say that, simply say that none of these resolutions has been really practiced or adhered by Israel themselves. What is happening? You know, it's a very difficult questions, and there's no direct answers to that. But as a civil society, you know, people of conscience, we would like to see very much that at least, you know, these resolutions have been adhered to by Israel. So what what is happening actually, you know?
Well, it's all about enforcement. The United Nations can pass a resolution, but if they can't enforce it, then the resolution just sits there. You know, the State of Israel is not going to adhere to United Nations resolutions unless it's forced to do so. So you either bring in a military force and you force them to do that, and that's not going to happen. Or you resort to boycott and to sanctions. And maintaining boycott and sanctions and divestment is an incredible tool. It's an excellent tool. To a great degree, that is what brought down apartheid in Africa. That is the tool that we have as civil society, as independent nations and states, to act against countries like Israel, where you have all these resolutions, you have all these issues taking place, but there's no way to enforce. So if the United Nations cannot enforce, and there is nobody is interested in a military confrontation, that's not realistic. So there's the aspect of boycott, and I think it's incredibly important. I mean, the possibility of boycott, and sanctions and divestment are an excellent tool that every country can take part in. Of course, like we said earlier, the United Arab Emirates decided to go in the opposite direction. But really, the direction should be boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And it's very, very important, particularly in countries that do support the Palestinian cause, that no business is done with the State of Israel, that Israeli companies find a closed door when they come to these countries. That is incredibly, incredibly important. The boycott, the sanctions, and the sanctions are imposed. Without that is really the best tool and the only tool I think we have as civil society, as people of conscience, like you said, and as independent nations. We need to push our politicians, we need to push our elected officials, we need to push our governments, and we need to push private business as well, private enterprise, to boycott the State of Israel, to boycott Israeli companies, and to impose sanctions on the State of Israel, and to divest from companies who do business with Israel. This is an excellent tool, and we need to see, it's beginning, we see some of it. But we're not seeing enough, because we know very well that even countries who do support the Palestinians and do support justice in Palestine still do business with the State of Israel. So I think that is incredibly, incredibly important. That is the one tool that we have that we have not tapped into that potential yet.
That's one of the, the strongest way what we could do now, for the boycott, and we have seen results and because of this boycott effect. Um, so another sector that which is very uh, uh, very important in the entire systems, which is the education systems. Yeah. Um, does the education systems also been in Israel reflects the apartheid by the government? You know, do they are they equally treating the children of the Palestinian children and also the Israeli children the same um, uh, privilege in terms of education wise? Yeah, can you please explain?
No, absolutely not. I mean, the money that is spent on schools for Israeli Jewish children, uh, and the resources and the funding that is provided and is available to schools that teach Palestinian children are entirely different. Entirely different. You can't. There's no comparison. When you look at the actual physical schools, the physical structures, when you look at the number of students per class, when you look at the resources that they have, you can't even begin to. And now we're talking about, mind you, the state of Israel only takes responsibility, and not much responsibility, but takes responsibility for the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. So in other words, the Palestinian towns who are whose residents are citizens of the state of Israel. There are about 2 million of those. So it's relatively speaking, it's a small percentage of the Palestinians. But then you have 2 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip who live in a prison. They have no access to resources at all. Their schools are being bombed and are completely destroyed. And you have the Palestinians who live in the West Bank, who live in prisons and little Bantustans in that area of Palestine. And the resources and the access that they have is not even remotely the same as what Israeli children have. Also, that it goes on beyond that. It goes, after school activities, parks, the ability to have green areas and places to play, places to have sports and things like that, which are equally important for children. Those resources don't exist. Again, I'll talk about, the Nakab in the southern part of which is the entire half of Palestine. Almost 250,000 Palestinians live there with no access to any of these things. Whereas Israeli Jewish children have, the nicest schools, the best playgrounds, parks to play, and so on. And this is true throughout the entire country. So in terms of, when we talk about in terms of access to education, in terms of resources that are put into education, we see the apartheid in action, and it makes perfect sense because Israel is not going to invest and does not want Palestinians to be educated. They don't want Palestinians to have the resources because they want to get rid of them. So they deny them water, they deny them education, they deny them the ability to build a house. They take away their land, so they have no place to build a house, so they have no places to live. They restrict their movement, so they can't go from one city. Palestinians can't travel quite often from one Palestinian city to the other, and so forth. So I mean, this is a big part of the racism. Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's so frustrating. I've been to Gaza twice. I've seen the schools. Uh, like you said, these are UNRWA school, yeah, under the United Nations care. And in the West Bank, are there also schools like this for the Gaza? I mean, for the Palestinians, or are the schools are, only handled by the Israeli government?
No, in the West Bank, you have UNRWA schools as well, but you also have other schools. You have schools that are private. You've got schools that are run by the Palestinian authorities, Ministry of Education and so forth. But you can't compare the resources with the resources that the Israeli children have. Even, the West Bank really the West Bank doesn't exist. What is left of the West Bank are small ghettos where Palestinians live. And in this region that is full of Israeli only Jewish towns. Now, the Israeli Jewish towns, colonies, settlements, all over the West Bank have wonderful schools. You know, the resources are incredible. They're brand new. They're beautiful. And in these ghettos, the Palestinians live with whatever means they have, which are not much. So some of them are UNRWA schools, particularly in the refugee camps.
Oh, see, but in Gaza they have universities, yeah. They have at least they can go for tertiary education. But in the West Bank, does do the Palestinians are they allowed to have a tertiary education to enter the universities there?
Yeah, they have universities, Palestinian universities in the West Bank, of course, yes.
I see. Okay, but still the standards are very much different, yeah.
Well, access, again, it's all about access to resources. It's all about the ability to build. It's all about the ability to go to school, not to have to go, you know, to 5 checkpoints between your house and the school, to make sure that the university is open, not closed, to make sure that the teachers are, the professors get paid their salaries.
Mm-hmm.
You know, these are the small things that make it possible, and these are precisely the problems. So physically, the universities are there. There are many universities, many good universities, in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, but it's a question of resources and access. And if you deny resources and you make access very, very difficult, and then students are being arrested and thrown in jail, and then they spend a year in detention, and they can't come back to school because they missed the year. You know what I mean? This is the reality that makes the education almost impossible. You know, you have to be very, very dedicated and work extremely hard in order to just get to the school, get to the university. And then when you go home, you have to do research, you have to do homework, you have to be able to read, you need electricity. You know, we can take electricity for granted. You can't take electricity and light and access to Wi-Fi for granted if you're a Palestinian in Palestine. If you're an Israeli Jew, you can. There's no problem. Israeli Jews have electricity, access, water, Wi-Fi, no problem. But if you're a Palestinian, you can't take that. You can't assume you're going to have. You can't even assume that you're going to have water in the morning when you come to wash your face or take a shower. You can't assume there's going to be. You have to assume that there probably won't be water. You know what I mean? So it starts very basic. And of course, so many homes are under demolition order. You might wake up in the morning and find out the army destroying your home. You know, only in Jerusalem only, they have over 15,000 homes under demolition order. In the Nakab, I keep talking about the Nakab in the southern part of the country because the Nakab is the entire southern part of Palestine. And these are Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. In 2017, 2018, and 2019, Israel destroyed over 2,000 homes each year. Over 2,000 homes each year. And these are these are Palestinians who happen to be citizens of the state of Israel. So you talk about going to school or going to university, having access to a classroom. You don't know if your home is going to be destroyed or not. It's very likely that your home is going to be destroyed. And when you get up in the morning, there'll be no home, no computer, no school, no nothing. You know. So this is a severe reality where it's not just one thing that is difficult, but you have a whole system that makes life unlivable. Because the goal of the state of Israel is to destroy, to take land, and to either have the Palestinians leave or die, whichever comes first. They don't really care, as long as they get rid of the Palestinians. So this is a very, very severe reality, and all the other components are just the tools that they have in order to facilitate the process of getting rid of the Palestinians and taking their land.
It sounds very apartheid to me. And of course, I think the user, I mean, the viewer now would understand, yeah, the real situations in Palestine. Should we call it Palestine or Israel? Yeah. So
no, we should call it Palestine. We should call it Palestine.
Palestine, yes. And must call Palestine. Okay. Coming back to this apartheid regime, yeah, or apartheid Israel. The question always prop up like, does Israel really want peace? What actually do you want?
No, Israel doesn't want peace. Israel does not want peace. And again, this goes back to the terminology. So Israel does not recognize that there's such a thing as Palestine. But we know that this country has been called Palestine for thousands of years. In fact, I always recommend this book by the Palestinian historian Nur Masalha. He shows how the name Palestine has been used to describe that country going back almost 4,000 years. So it's called Palestine, a 4,000-year history. I recommend the book. So I think it's imperative, first of all, that we call the country Palestine. Because if we call it Israel, we're legitimizing the state of Israel. We're legitimizing the apartheid. And so we are recognizing it and we're normalizing it. So I think it's incredibly important that we call the country Palestine, which is the name that the people of Palestine call it. Palestinians call it Palestine. It's their country. So that's how we know what we're supposed to call it, number one. Number two, when we talk about the process that is taking place in Palestine, when we talk about apartheid, ethnic cleansing, genocide, these are crimes that have been recognized as crimes in international law. In other words, these crimes are well defined. When I say genocide, when I say ethnic cleansing or apartheid, these are just not just words. These are very specific crimes that have been defined. And if anybody wants to go and take a look at the very definition of the crime of genocide, of the crime of ethnic cleansing, and so on, the crime of apartheid, it's there, it exists, there is a definition, and you compare that to the reality in Palestine, and then you see that it fits. The definition fits the reality. Therefore, we know that these crimes are being committed. Now, does Israel want peace? Well, a country that maintains an apartheid regime, a country that is engaged in ethnic cleansing and an ongoing genocide for decades. We're not talking about an incident or a short period of time. We're talking about over almost 100 years, because this process began before the actual establishment of the state of Israel. So we're talking about almost 100 years. A country that has been engaged in this, a community, a nation that has been engaged in this kind of a process against other people for that long, can anybody claim that they want peace? Peace is not even part of their vocabulary, And so, of course, Israel does not. Peace and Israel cannot coexist. You either support peace, and then you have to work to bring about justice, to bring about the return of the Palestinian refugees, to decolonize Palestine from Zionism, to create a just society, a just democracy with one person, one vote, get rid of the privilege or at least spread the privilege evenly. Then you can talk about a life that has, a life where people live in peace. But just the word peace, they say that they just signed a peace agreement with the UAE. It's ridiculous. So Israel does not want peace. Israel is a political entity that is engaged in some of the worst crimes defined by international law, and has been engaged in these crimes for almost 100 years. So we need to take that into consideration, and we need to understand just how important it is to impose boycott, to impose sanctions on the state of Israel, to refrain from doing business with Israel, to refrain from engaging and cooperating with Israeli companies, allowing them to come and build factories and so on, because these are ongoing crimes that are very, very severe.
Yeah, yes, exactly. What you said is very much true. In fact, in Malaysia, we are working very hard with this BDS campaign. Of course, we established BDS Malaysia. We'll talk about that in the other session. However, besides this BDS movement that you talked about just now in length, perhaps that as for the people who are not directly involved in this Palestinian activism, ordinary people on the street, what actually can they do, to support, to bring down this apartheid Israel? What can they do? How to contribute?
Well, in Malaysia, you have a BDS organization. You have a very active BDS organization. They can join, they can participate, they can learn. The first thing we need to do is to be educated. So, to be educated and understand. And I think certainly in a country like Malaysia, you have access to that information. And then to join the movement, to join the organization, to participate, to engage in educating other people, to organize, to make sure that we spread the word, to make sure that, and I'm sure that there are many ways that Israel would like to engage with Malaysia, to make sure that these engagements don't take place. I think it's all about spreading information, spreading the education, and making sure that the politicians, the people at the top, the people who represent Malaysia, for example, as an example, the people who are doing business, the main business people, the big business enterprises, make sure that they know that it is unacceptable to do business with Israel, that it will not go on, that this is not acceptable, this won't be allowed, and that people will stand up, that civil society will stand up. And I think this is crucial in every country, because Israel tries to get into every country. They try to do business with every country. They sell arms, they open factories, they provide jobs, they do all kinds of things. And it's important, it's imperative that people understand why they should refrain from doing any business with the state of Israel. And again, if we're talking about a country like Malaysia or other Muslim countries, Al-Aqsa is being taken over by settlers. The Israeli military raids Al-Aqsa almost every week. People are being killed there. There are plans in place. There are actual plans in place. And there are people sitting in the Israeli government today who support the plans to destroy Al-Aqsa, physically destroy it, to destroy the entire Al-Aqsa compound, to get rid of the Golden Dome. I mean, can you imagine Jerusalem without Al-Aqsa? So, I mean, this is not just hyperbole. This is not just demagoguery. We're not just talking about, theoretical ideas. We're talking about a reality where there are actual plans to do these things. So how do we participate? Well, we participate locally by making sure that in our country, in our city, our neighbors all understand why they should boycott and demand sanctions and divestment against the state of Israel until justice until Palestinians have the justice they deserve.
Yes, very much. Yeah, needed the educational part. Yes. That comes to almost the end of our session today, and we thank you very much, Miko. And we are so glad that we are fortunate that we have you tonight. And we believe that the viewers are also getting more information on how Israel being an apartheid state. So thank you very much, Miko. And next to this, we would like to just, if you just could bear a few minutes with us, I will just go into just this campaign that we have. We call it, we introduced the Heart Talk campaign, which is organized by the Malaysian Women Coalition. This campaign was actually to make sure that the Palestinian culture are being kept intact. There are many cultural things and food, for example, dishes, even dances, have been changed to Israel's wording, and they claim that those are theirs. So talk is actually refers to the Palestinian embroidery project, which will promote the cultural heritage of the Palestinian people. So we would like the viewer to get to know more about this from our website. Just go to bit.ly /heart, HEART, talk, THOBE, Heart Talk, one word, yeah. And there will be, for those who contribute to this project, there will be a complimentary ebook. So this is also very important. And I think before we end the session, we just would like to share also on the next month lecture, which is now we are coming into the 4th series of the lecture. And we will have our speaker, which I mentioned just now. We have BDS, Boycott, Divestment, Sanction Malaysia, And our chairman for the BDS Malaysia, Prof. Nazari Ismail, will be featured in this lecture 4. And the date is on the 17th of September 2020. And the topic is very much relevant, which is BDS, yeah, and what BDS is all about. So why is it important? Yeah, this BDS. So the viewers out there, please do not forget this date, 17 September, 9 p.m. Malaysian time. And Miko, if you're free, please join us as well.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So with that, we end the session tonight. And again, thank you very much. And we are very sorry for the a bit of technical mishap just now. And we do hope in the future that we would be able to have you again. And if things permit, inshallah, please welcome back to Malaysia. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.